cold porcelain pressed against her cheek, vibrating with the heavy thud of a man's boots. She was just a maid, a ghost in a sprawling mansion of sinners. But when a pair of drunken enforcers decided she was their prey, the devil himself intervened. He didn't save her out of mercy. He saved her out of a ruthless need for order. And when he finally looked into her eyes, he didn't see a victim. He saw the spitting image of the man he swore to destroy. Grease clung to the industrial stovetop, stubborn and ancient. Celestia dragged a heavy steel wool sponge across the metal, her knuckles white beneath thin yellow rubber gloves. At 2 a.m, the Romano estate was quiet, save for the hum of the massive refrigerators and the occasional distant slam of a car door. Silence was a rare commodity in a house built on loud, violent money, and she guarded her graveyard shifts fiercely. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint streak of soot across her pale skin. For 8 months, she had been Anna Lewis. Anna kept her head down. Anna spoke only when spoken to. Anna mopped the floors, folded the heavy linen sheets, and ignored the muffled shouts that sometimes echoed from the basement. Survival required blinders, and Celestia wore hers tight. She was a master of invisibility. Water splashed into the deep basin as she rinsed the sponge. Her back ached. Her feet throbbed in cheap, slip-resistant shoes. It was a miserable existence. But misery was safe. Misery didn't ask questions about her past, and it certainly didn't care about the bounty on her head. Harsh laughter shattered the quiet. Celestia froze, her hands submerged in the soapy water. The heavy kitchen doors swung open, hitting the rubber stoppers with a violent slap. 2 men stumbled in, bringing with them the sour stench of stale beer, cheap cologne, and sweat. One was Leo, a mid-level enforcer with a neck like a cinder block and knuckles scarred from years of collections. The other was a younger recruit, twitchy and arrogant, his eyes blown wide and glassy. Celestia didn't know his name. She didn't want to. She kept her back to them, scrubbing at a spotless section of the counter. Invisible. Stay invisible. Hey, sweetheart. Leo's voice was thick, slurred at the edges. Celestia didn't turn. She scrubbed harder. Deaf, are you? The younger man snickered. He stepped closer. She could hear the squeak of his leather shoes on the damp tile. Leo's talking to you. Just finishing the cleaning, sir. Celestia said, keeping her voice flat, devoid of any inflection. She drained the sink and reached for a towel. I'll be out of your way in a moment. We don't want you out of the way. Leo's heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. Celestia stiffened. The grip was tight enough to bruise. She forced herself to breathe, burying the instinct to pivot and drive her elbow into his throat. She wasn't a fighter, not really, but she knew how to hurt a man. Doing so here, however, meant exposure. Exposure meant death. I need to finish my shift, she repeated, staring straight ahead at the tiled wall. The younger man moved around the counter, blocking her exit. He reached out, flicking the edge of her stained apron. Boss is asleep. Everyone's asleep. Why don't you make us a sandwich, huh? Or something else? Celestia took a step back, hitting the edge of the sink. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic animal rhythm. Please, just let me do my job. You work for us, Leo grunted. He yanked her backward by the shoulder, spinning her around. The movement was too fast, too aggressive. Celestia lost her footing on the slick tile. She hit the floor hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain flared up her neck. She gasped, scrambling backward like a crab, her wet gloves slipping on the linoleum. Leo laughed, a low, ugly sound. He unbuckled his belt. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Celestia's veins. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't intimidation. The blinders were off, and the reality of what these men were crashed over her. She scrambled for the nearest counter, her hand closing around the heavy iron handle of a frying pan left on the drying rack. Don't touch me, she snarled, her voice dropping its meek facade. The twitchy kid lunged. Celestia swung the pan. It caught him in the ribs with a dull, satisfying crack. He howled, stumbling backward and clutching his side. Leo's face darkened. The amusement vanished, replaced by a brutal, ugly rage. You stupid bitch! He moved faster than a man his size should. Before Celestia could swing again, his boot caught her in the stomach. The air exploded from her lungs. She dropped the pan, curling into a tight ball on the wet floor, gagging for breath. Leo knelt, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her head back. Tears of pain pricked her eyes. "Going to teach you some manners," Leo whispered, his breath hot and foul against her face. Celestia closed her eyes. She braced for the strike. She calculated the distance to the knife block. If she could just reach it. The kitchen doors didn't swing open this time. They were pushed slowly and deliberately. "Leo." The voice was quiet. It wasn't a shout. It was barely a conversational tone, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. Leo froze. His hand, still twisted in Celestia's hair, went rigid. The twitchy kid, still clutching his ribs, went pale. Celestia opened her eyes, straining to look towards the door. Hinges groaned as the heavy oak door settled back into its frame. Vance Romano stood in the entryway. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 days. He wore a charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, the tie pulled loose from a collar that had wilted hours ago. Shadows bruised the skin under his dark eyes. He held a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his right hand. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, dangerously bored. "Boss!" Leo stammered, his fingers instantly releasing Celestia's hair. He scrambled to his feet, trying to discreetly rebuckle his belt. "We were just—" "She was giving us attitude?" Vance took a slow sip from his glass. The ice clinked. In the dead silence of the kitchen, it sounded like a gunshot. He walked forward. His footsteps were measured. He didn't look at Celestia, who was still curled on the floor, dragging ragged breaths into her bruised ribs. His eyes were locked entirely on Leo. "Attitude," Vance repeated. The word rolled off his tongue, tasting sour. "Yeah, smashed Jimmy in the ribs with a pan." Leo pointed a thick finger at the younger man, who nodded furiously, trying to stand up straight despite the obvious pain. Vance stopped a foot away from Leo. He looked at the heavy man, then glanced down at the belt. He looked at Jimmy, who was sweating through his cheap shirt. Finally, Vance's gaze dropped to Celestia. He took in the wet floor, the discarded frying pan, the way she was holding her stomach, her jaw tight, refusing to cry. "This is a kitchen," Vance said, his voice flat. "Not a brothel." "Boss, I swear, we didn't—" Vance moved with a sudden, terrifying fluidity. He didn't wind up. He didn't telegraph the strike. The heavy crystal glass in his hand smashed directly into the bridge of Jimmy's nose. Cartilage crunched. Blood sprayed across the pristine stainless steel refrigerator. Jimmy screamed, dropping to his knees and clutching his ruined face, blood pouring through his fingers. Leo took a step back, raising his hands. "Vance, wait, wait!" Vance dropped the shattered remains of the glass onto the floor. He wiped a drop of blood from his knuckles with his thumb. "You're making a mess in my house, Leo. I pay people good money to keep this place clean. You're undoing their hard work. It won't happen again. I swear to God, Vance, we were just drunk." "You're fired," Vance said. Leo blinked, stupidly. "Fired? Leave the property. If you're still on the grounds in 10 minutes, I'll have Marcus put a bullet in your kneecap. If you're here in 15, he'll put it in your head." Vance's tone remained conversational, completely devoid of heat. It was just a statement of fact. "Take the bleeder with you." Leo didn't argue. He knew better. He grabbed Jimmy by the scruff of his neck, hauling the sobbing young man to his feet, and practically dragged him out the back door. The hydraulic hinge hissed, clicking shut and plunging the kitchen back into silence. Vance stood there for a long moment, staring at the blood on the floor. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He looked exhausted. Slowly he turned his attention back to the woman on the floor. Celestia hadn't moved. She watched him with wide, guarded eyes. She knew exactly who he was. Vance Romano, the head of the Romano Syndicate. A man who had built his empire on a foundation of cold, calculated violence. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was the dragon. He didn't offer her a hand. He just stared down at her. "Get up," he said. Celestia swallowed the copper taste in her mouth. She pushed herself up, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. She refused to show weakness. She stood straight, keeping her eyes cast downward, playing the role of the terrified maid. "Thank you, Mr. Romano," she murmured, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. Vance didn't reply immediately. He tilted his head, studying her. "You didn't scream." Celestia kept her gaze glued to his polished Italian leather shoes. "I didn't want to wake the house, sir. Most people scream when a 200-pound enforcer drags them by the hair." Vance took a step closer. The smell of scotch and expensive tobacco wafted off him. "You grabbed a frying pan. You went for the ribs. Good tactical choice. Better than swinging for the head and missing." "It was just instinct, sir. Look at me." Celestia hesitated. Slowly she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Vance's eyes were dark, almost black, and devoid of any warmth. He searched her face. Celestia held her breath, praying the dim lighting hid the sharp contours of her jaw, the specific shade of her grey eyes. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Anna Lewis." Vance stared at her for 5 agonizing seconds. He noted the way she held herself. Not trembling, not weeping. She was braced for an impact, holding her terror back with a discipline that absolutely did not belong to a domestic worker. "Clean yourself up, Anna," Vance said finally, turning on his heel. "Then come to my office. We need to have a chat about your workplace environment." Leather creaked in the dimly lit study as Vance settled into the heavy armchair behind his desk. The room was a stark contrast to the sterile kitchen. It was cluttered, smelling of old paper, leather polish, and spilled liquor. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with ledgers, legal volumes, and binders. This was the brain of the Romano operation, a place where lives were priced and debts were tallied. Celestia stood awkwardly just inside the doorway. She had taken 3 minutes in the staff bathroom to splash cold water on her face and smooth her hair back into a tight bun. The bruise on her cheekbone was already darkening to a sickly purple. Her ribs throbbed with every shallow breath. Vance poured himself a fresh glass of scotch from a crystal decanter. He didn't offer her one. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a hard-backed wooden chair opposite his desk. Celestia walked over and sat down, keeping her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The yellow rubber gloves were gone, revealing raw, red hands that had spent too many hours in hot water. Vance opened a drawer and pulled out a thin manila folder. He tossed it onto the desk. Celestia recognized the HR stamp on the corner. Her employment file. "Anna Lewis," Vance read from the top sheet. "Age 24. Last address, a shithole apartment complex in the South Ward. Previous employment, waitressing and retail. You've been mopping my floors for 8 months. "Yes, sir." "You're a quiet girl. My housekeeper says you never complain, never ask for days off, and you always take the night shifts." Vance leaned back, resting the glass against his chest. "You're a model employee." "I try to be, sir. So why did Jimmy's ribs sound like a cracked bat when you hit him?" Celestia maintained eye contact. "I grew up with brothers, sir. You learn to defend yourself." "Brothers." Vance flipped a page in the file. Says here you're an only child. Mother deceased, father unknown. Celestia's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. She had paid $3,000 for that background identity. It was supposed to hold up to basic scrutiny. She hadn't expected the boss of the family to personally audit it at 3 in the morning. That's what's on the paper, sir. But families are complicated. I lived in a lot of foster homes. There were always boys, always fights. She lied smoothly, layering truth with fiction to make it sound authentic. Vance took a slow sip of his drink. He wasn't buying it. He didn't say he wasn't buying it, but the heavy silence stretching between them made it painfully obvious. He was a man who interrogated killers for a living. A 24-year-old maid shouldn't have been able to hold his gaze without flinching. You didn't beg Leo to stop, Vance said, his voice lowering, taking on a dangerous, probing edge. You told him not to touch you. You gave an order. People who get beaten for a living, foster kids, abused wives, they beg, they cower. You commanded. I was angry, sir. You were cornered. There's a difference. Vance leaned forward, setting the glass down. The casual, bored demeanor was gone. He was entirely focused now, a predator dissecting its prey. Your accent is slipping, Anna. Celestia bit the inside of her cheek. She forced the harsh, flat vowels of the South Ward back into her throat. I don't know what you mean. Your posture, the way you sit, the way you hold your hands. Vance stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the desk. Celestia fought the urge to shrink back into the chair. You work a blue-collar job, but you don't have blue-collar habits. You sit with your ankles crossed, not your knees. Your back doesn't touch the chair. It's finishing school posture. Old money posture. He stopped beside her chair. The sheer size of him, the proximity, was suffocating. Show me your hands, he demanded. Celestia kept them folded in her lap. Sir, I just want to go back to my room. Show me your hands, or I call Marcus in here to look at them for me. He's much less polite. Slowly, her hands trembling just a fraction, Celestia lifted them and held them out, palms up. Vance reached down, grabbing her right wrist. His grip was entirely different from Leo's. It wasn't meant to cause pain. It was meant to restrain. An unbreakable vice. He dragged his thumb across her palm. Calluses, from the mop, the steel wool, hard work. He flipped her hand over. But the cuticles are perfect. The nail beds are naturally shaped, never bitten. And this... He rubbed his thumb over a faint white scar on the back of her left hand, just below the knuckle of her index finger. Celestia tried to pull her hand back. Vance held fast. That's a burn, Vance murmured, stepping back to look at her face. A very specific kind of burn. I have one just like it. He held up his own left hand, showing a nearly identical crescent-shaped scar. Ejection port of a customized 1911 pistol. The brass flies out hot. If you don't hold the grip exactly right when you're 14 and learning to shoot, it brands you. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through Celestia's composure. Her breath hitched. She yanked her hand back with all her strength. This time, Vance let it go. Who taught you to shoot a customized 1911, Anna? Vance asked. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a knife, pressing against her throat. My uncle. Stop lying! Vance slammed his hand onto the desk, the sudden noise making Celestia jump. Stand up. She stood, her legs feeling like lead. Vance stepped directly in front of her. He reached out, grabbing her chin, tilting her face up toward the harsh, glaring light of the desk lamp. She tried to turn away, but his grip was iron. He examined her face. Not the bruise. He looked past the dirt, the cheap hair dye she used to darken her natural copper hair, the exhausted slump of her shoulders. He stared into her eyes. Slate grey, flecked with an unnatural icy blue. He traced the sharp line of her jaw, the high cheekbones, the slight, arrogant curve of her upper lip that she couldn't completely hide, even in terror. Vance's breath stopped. The silence in the room became absolute, deafening. He let go of her chin as if he had been burned, taking a heavy step backward. His dark eyes widened, registering a shock so profound it temporarily erased the exhaustion from his face. He knew those eyes. He had seen them across negotiation tables. He had seen them in nightmares. They were the eyes of the man who had ordered the hit on his older brother, the man who had fractured the city's underworld and bathed the streets in fire. Desmond O'Shea. Vance looked at the woman standing in his office, the cheap maid uniform suddenly looking like a crude joke. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening violence. The posture, the scar. The sudden disappearance of Desmond O'Shea's only daughter a year ago, presumed dead in a car fire orchestrated by a rival gang. "You're not Anna Lewis." Vance breathed, the words barely making it past his lips. Celestia said nothing. Her silence was a confession. A dark, terrifying smile slowly spread across Vance's face. It held no joy, only the grim satisfaction of a hunter who realizes the ultimate prize just walked into his cage and handed him the key. "Hello, Celestia," Vance said, tasting the name of his greatest enemy's bloodline. "Welcome to my home." The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Celestia didn't flinch. The frantic, terrified Maid vanished, replaced by a stillness that was far more dangerous. The slump left her shoulders. Her spine straightened, aligning with the rigid posture of a woman raised in boardrooms and blood-spattered basements. If she was going to die tonight, she wouldn't do it on her knees. "You're a long way from home, Celestia," Vance said. His voice was a rasp, testing the reality of the situation. "Home burned down," she replied. Her voice had changed too. The flat, nasal twang of the South Ward melted away. Her natural cadence was sharper, educated, dripping with the same icy cynicism that coated Vance's world. Vance slowly walked back to his desk and leaned against the edge. He crossed his arms, studying her like a complex cipher he had just cracked. "The car fire on the interstate. Dental records confirmed it was you. My people pulled the coroner's report themselves to make sure Desmond wasn't playing a game." "Desmond wasn't playing a game. He thinks I'm Ash," Celestia said flatly. "I paid a street clinic 10 grand to swap the dental molds. The girl in the car was a runner who overdosed 3 days prior. I just helped her find a more spectacular cremation." Vance's eyebrows twitched, a flicker of genuine surprise. "Cold. Pragmatic." Celestia pressed a hand lightly against her ribs, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving behind a sharp, throbbing ache. "If you're going to kill me, Vance, do it now. My shift ends at 6, and I'd rather not bleed out on your Persian rug." Vance laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was a short, sharp exhalation of disbelief. "Kill you? Celestia, your father has been bleeding my territory dry for 2 years. He put my brother in the ground. You are the sole heir to the O'Shea Syndicate. You're the most valuable asset in this city, and you've been scrubbing my toilets. I don't belong to him anymore. I'm not his heir. I'm a ghost." "Not anymore." Vance reached over to his desk phone and pressed a button. "Gabriel, get in here." Celestia tensed. Her eyes darted toward the heavy oak door. She weighed the distance, the possibility of slipping past Vance, making it to the hall. Vance saw the calculation in her eyes and shook his head slowly. "Don't," he warned. "You caught Leo off guard because he thought you were prey. I know exactly what you are. You take 1 step toward that door, and I'll break your leg before you reach the handle." The door opened. Gabriel stepped in. He was leaner than Leo, older, dressed in a sharp black suit with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He took one look at Celestia, standing rigid in her maid's uniform, and then looked at Vance. "Problem, boss?" Gabriel asked smoothly. "Gabriel, meet our newest guest," Vance said, his eyes never leaving Celestia's face. "Celestia O'Shea, Gabriel's hand hovered instinctively near his jacket lapel, his entire demeanor shifting from relaxed to lethal in a fraction of a second. He stared at Celestia, processing the impossibility of the statement. Desmond's kid. She's dead. Evidently not. Vance murmured. Take her to the east wing, the corner suite. No windows that open, clear out anything sharp. Lock the door from the outside, and post 2 men at the end of the hall. If she gets out, I'm holding you personally responsible. Gabriel nodded slowly. Understood. Come on, kid, walk. Celestia looked at Vance. There was no plea for mercy in her eyes, only a cold, burning defiance. She turned on her heel and walked out the door, her chin held high, ignoring the shooting pain in her abdomen. The corner suite in the east wing was a gilded cage. The bed was a massive 4-poster draped in heavy silk. The carpets were thick, swallowing the sound of her footsteps. The ensuite bathroom gleamed with marble and gold fixtures. It was a staggering contrast to the cramped, windowless closet she had slept in for the past 8 months. She walked straight to the bathroom mirror and turned on the harsh vanity lights. The face staring back at her was a mess. The cheap brown dye was fading at her roots, revealing flashes of copper. The bruise on her cheekbone was a swollen, violent purple. She turned on the cold water, soaked a plush washcloth, and pressed it against her face. She had survived the night, but the real danger was just beginning. Vance Romano didn't keep prisoners out of charity, he kept them for leverage. And the moment he realized she had absolutely no leverage over Desmond O'Shea, her value would plummet to 0. Celestia sank to the cool marble floor, pulling her knees to her chest. For the first time in a year, she allowed herself to tremble. She was locked in the house of her father's greatest enemy. The invisibility cloak was gone. The lock clicked heavily at 8 in the morning. Celestia was already awake. She hadn't slept. She sat in a velvet armchair in the corner of the room, still wearing the stained maid's uniform. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. Vance entered. He had showered and changed into a fresh suit, crisp and charcoal grey. He looked rested, dangerous, and entirely in control. He carried a small leather medical bag in one hand and a silver tray in the other. He set the tray on the low coffee table. It held a steaming cup of black coffee and a plate of toast. Eat, he ordered, pulling a chair opposite hers and sitting down. Celestia didn't move towards the food. She watched him open the medical bag. I don't need a doctor. You're not getting one, Vance said, pulling out a roll of medical tape, a pair of scissors, and a bottle of iodine. My private physician asks too many questions, and I'm not ready to explain why a dead girl is bleeding in my guest room. Take off the apron and unbutton the shirt. Celestia stiffened. Excuse me? Vance's eyes met hers, flat and devoid of any sexual interest. It was a purely clinical command. Leo wears steel-toed boots. If he fractured a rib and it punctures your lung, you drown in your own blood. I need you alive. Unbutton the shirt, Celestia. She hesitated, her jaw tight. Slowly she reached up and unfastened the top 4 buttons of her uniform, pulling the fabric aside to expose her left rib cage. The skin was a horrifying canvas of deep black, purple, and sickly yellow. Vance leaned forward. His fingers were cold as they pressed gently against the inflamed tissue. Celestia hissed, her breath hitching as pain shot through her chest. Too cracked, none broken, Vance muttered, his touch surprisingly deft. He saturated a cotton pad with iodine and cleaned a small cut near her hip where the floor tile had sliced her. You'll live, but it's going to hurt to breathe for a month. He began wrapping her torso with expert precision, pulling the bandages tight enough to support the ribs, but loose enough to allow shallow breathing. Why my house? Vance asked quietly as he worked. Celestia looked over his shoulder, focusing on the intricate pattern of the wallpaper. It's the one place in the city my father's men couldn't walk into. There are other cities, other countries. You had 10 grand for a fake dental mold. You had enough for a passport. You don't know Desmond, Celestia said, her voice turning bitter. The world is very small when you have a bounty on your head. He has eyes in Europe. He has the cartels in the south. If I ran, he would have found me. The only way to survive was to disappear in plain sight. Right under his nose, right under yours. Vance secured the tape and leaned back, packing the supplies away. He picked up the coffee cup and held it out to her. Celestia took it. The warmth seeped into her cold, trembling fingers. He thinks you're dead. Why the bounty? Vance asked. Celestia took a sip of the bitter coffee. She needed the caffeine. She needed her brain to be sharp. This was the negotiation. This was where she proved she was worth keeping alive. He was going to sell me, Celestia said plainly. The Bratva have been pushing into the northern ports. Desmond needed their supply lines. The head of the Volkov family has a son, a psychotic, violent degenerate who collects women and breaks them. Desmond offered me as a bridal peace offering to secure the docks. Vance's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. In their world, arranged marriages were common, but selling a daughter to a known sadist wasn't strategy. It was a betrayal of blood. I refused, Celestia continued, her grip tightening on the ceramic mug. He beat me until I couldn't stand, told me I was property. So, I took his favorite customized 1911 out of his desk, shot 2 of his guards in the kneecaps, and walked out the front door. Vance stared at her. You shot his personal guards? I'm a very good shot, Vance. You saw the scar. She set the mug down. I didn't fake my death just to hide. I faked it to buy time. Time for what? To tear his empire down to the studs. Celestia leaned forward, ignoring the burning in her ribs. The mask of the terrified maid was completely gone, replaced by the lethal, calculating air of a crime syndicate. I grew up in his office. I didn't play with dolls. I balanced ledgers. I know where every offshore account is hidden. I know the shipping schedules for the northern ports. I know which judges he owns and which police captains he pays off. Vance went perfectly still. The air in the room seemed to compress. He was looking at a roadmap to his enemy's destruction, wrapped in bandages and sitting in his velvet chair. You want revenge? Vance stated. I want him ruined. I want him stripped of everything he built, and I want him to know it was me who did it. Celestia met his gaze, her grey eyes locking onto his dark ones. You have the muscle, Vance. You have the guns, the territory, and the men. But you don't know his blind spots. I do. And in exchange for handing me your father's head on a platter, my freedom, Celestia said. A new identity. A passport that holds up to international scrutiny, and enough cash to disappear somewhere sunny where the name O'Shea means absolutely nothing. Vance stood up. He walked over to the window, looking out over the sprawling, manicured lawns of his estate. He was a cautious man. Deals made in desperation were often laced with poison. But the logic was sound. Desmond had grown paranoid and erratic over the past year, fortifying his positions. A direct war would cost Vance half his men. Celestia was a skeleton key to the entire O'Shea operation. He turned back to face her. If you lie to me, Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. If you lead my men into a trap, or if you hold back a single dime of his accounts, I won't kill you, Celestia. I'll put a bow on your head and hand-deliver you to the Volkov boy. Celestia didn't flinch. She reached out her hand, palm up. Do we have a deal, Mr. Romano? Vance looked at her outstretched hand. He stepped forward and gripped it. His hand swallowed hers, calloused and rough, sealing a pact born entirely of mutual hatred for the same man. We have a deal, Ms. O'Shea. Let's go burn your father's house down. The basement of the Romano estate was an entirely different beast from the gilded halls above. It smelled of damp concrete, stale cigarette smoke, and the ozone hum of heavy electronics. For three days it had been Celestia's entire world. She stood over a massive teakwood table, her weight shifted to her right leg to ease the constant dull throbbing in her ribs. A blueprint of the city's industrial shipping district was spread out beneath her hands, anchored by heavy crystal ashtrays. Gabriel stood on the opposite side of the table, his arms crossed. He had barely spoken to her since Vance brought her down here, but his silence was loud. It was the silence of a man waiting for a snake to bite. Vance sat at the head of the table. He wore a simple black Henley, the sleeves pushed up, revealing a map of faded ink on his forearms. He was on his third cup of black coffee. He hadn't slept. Neither had she. "The textile imports," Celestia said, tapping a manicured fingernail against a warehouse designated as Pier 47. The cheap brown dye in her hair was beginning to wash out completely, leaving a crown of dull copper under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Desmond uses it as a blind. On paper it's Egyptian cotton and synthetic silk. In reality it's the primary transit hub for the Bratva's weapons trafficking." Gabriel scoffed, a dry, abrasive sound. "We've had eyes on Pier 47 for 6 months. Customs sweeps it bi-weekly. Our guys have watched the manifests. It's clean. If your old man is moving weight through there, he's a magician." "He's not a magician, Gabriel. He's an accountant," Celestia replied, not looking up from the map. She didn't let the enforcer's hostility rattle her. Emotion was a liability down here. Customs checks the containers at the front of the ship. Desmond bribes the harbour master to stagger the unloading manifest. The real cargo is in the auxiliary holds, registered under a dummy corporation, Apex Logistics. The trucks arrive at 3:00 a.m., 2 hours before the customs agents start their shift. They bypass the main gate entirely and use the old service access road by the seawall. Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Apex Logistics. We looked into them. They're a shell company based out of Panama, dead ends across the board." "Because you were looking for a paper trail," Celestia said. "Look for the money. The harbour master's name is William Hayes. He makes 80 grand a year on the city payroll, yet his daughter just started her freshman year at a private university in Switzerland, and he bought a summer home in the Hamptons. Desmond pays him in untraceable bearer bonds, delivered on the 1st of every month at a diner in the South Ward." Vance's eyes met Gabriel's. A silent conversation passed between them, a rapid calculation of risk and reward. "Tonight is the 12th, Vance said slowly. "A shipment is due?" 3 containers, Celestia confirmed. "High-grade military surplus, suppressors, optics, and enough armor-piercing rounds to supply a small militia. The Bratva relies on Desmond to get it past the Coast Guard. If he loses this shipment, the Volkov family will see it as a breach of contract. They'll demand compensation he can't provide. It fractures his alliance." Gabriel leaned over the table, planting his palms on the blueprints. He stared directly into Celestia's face. "If we roll up on Pier 47 and this is a setup, my men are walking into a kill box. Your father's snipers could be sitting on those cranes right now, waiting for us to take the bait." Celestia met his stare without blinking. "If this is a setup, Gabriel, you put a bullet in the back of my head. But it's not. Desmond operates on routine and arrogance. He thinks he's untouchable because nobody looks past the customs stamps. Prove him wrong." The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to grow louder. Vance studied Celestia. He was looking for the tell, a twitch of the eye, a tightening of the jaw. But Celestia offered nothing. She had spent 24 years surviving Desmond O'Shea's volatile temper. She knew how to build a wall of ice around her nervous system. Finally, Vance pushed his chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the concrete floor. "Gabriel," Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Assemble 2 strike teams, suppressed weapons only. I want the tires on those Apex trucks slashed before they even finish loading. Nobody leaves that pier. Burn the cargo, take the cash, and leave the drivers tied to the steering wheels for the harbor patrol to find. Gabriel straightened up. He didn't argue. You want me to bring Hayes in? No, leave Hayes alone. When Desmond realizes his shipment is ash, he'll think Hayes sold him out. Let Desmond kill his own harbor master. It saves us a bullet and creates paranoia in his ranks. Vance turned to Celestia. You're staying here. I expected to, she said flatly. If my men don't come back. Vance warned, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Neither do you. They'll come back, Celestia said, turning away from the table. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her bruised ribs. Just make sure they don't miss. The clock in Vance's office read 4:15 a.m. Celestia sat in the heavy leather armchair, her knees pulled up, staring into the dead fireplace. The house was entirely silent, a tomb of waiting. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the harsh, unforgiving face of her father. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the empire she had been bred to inherit. She was systematically dismantling her own legacy. It was a strange, hollow feeling. There was no triumph in it, no cinematic rush of righteous vengeance. It was just grim, mechanical survival. Desmond O'Shea was a monster, but he was the monster who had taught her how to tie her shoes, how to fire a gun, how to spot a lie. Betraying him felt like amputating a limb to stop an infection. Necessary, but horrifyingly permanent. The heavy oak door clicked open. Celestia didn't jump, but her breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned her head. Vance stood in the doorway. He looked entirely different from the man who had left 3 hours ago. His tactical jacket was soaked with rain and smelled sharply of diesel fuel, ozone, and the distinct coppery tang of blood. Water had dripped from his dark hair onto the expensive Persian rug. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, exhausted cadence. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the antique liquor cabinet, pulled out a bottle of straight bourbon, and poured 2 heavy fingers into a glass. He didn't bother with ice. He downed it in a single, fluid motion, his throat working. Celestia watched him, her heart hammering against her taped ribs. Well? Vance set the glass down with a heavy clunk. He leaned his forearms on the cabinet, dropping his head for a brief, heavy moment. Then he turned to face her. 3 trucks, Vance said, his voice raspy. 17 crates of high-grade munitions, 4 Bratva handlers, 6 of Desmond's dock boys. Casualties? She asked, her voice tightly controlled. None of mine, Vance replied. He walked over to his desk and unbuckled the heavy leather shoulder holster, letting it drop onto the wood with a dull thud. Gabriel took the north flank. The dock boys didn't even have time to unholster their weapons. We poured diesel over the crates and lit the match. It burned so hot it melted the tires to the asphalt. Celestia let out a slow, shaking breath. The tension that had been coiled in her spine for the past 3 hours finally snapped, leaving her feeling liquid and exhausted. It was real. The first domino had fallen. Volkov is going to demand answers by sunrise, Celestia said softly, staring back into the empty fireplace. Desmond will blame Hayes. He'll execute him by noon. The harbor will go into lockdown, stalling the rest of Desmond's legitimate imports. It's a financial hemorrhage. Vance walked over and dropped into the armchair opposite her. He looked at her closely. The rain had washed away the sterile, calculated mob boss, leaving behind a man who had just waded through violence and fire. You don't look happy, Vance observed. I didn't do this for happiness, Celestia replied, meeting his gaze. I did it for breathing room. Vance reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, tightly wrapped bundle of $100 bills. It was singed at the edges, smelling of smoke. He tossed it onto the coffee table between them. It landed with a heavy smack. Found that in the cab of the lead truck. The payoff for the Bratva handlers. 50 grand. Vance said. Consider it your first commission. Celestia looked at the money. It was the physical manifestation of her betrayal. She felt sick to her stomach. She reached out, picking up the stack of bills. The paper was rough, gritty with ash. You think this buys my conscience? She asked, her voice dropping to a bitter whisper. No, Vance said, his tone surprisingly gentle, devoid of his usual cynicism. I think it buys your passport. We made a deal, Celestia. You deliver Desmond's empire, I deliver your freedom. That's the down payment. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face, smearing a streak of soot across his cheekbone. For a fleeting second, he looked entirely vulnerable. Just a man trapped in a generational war, bleeding out slowly in the dark. It's an ugly business, Vance said quietly, staring at the ceiling. Tearing down your own blood. I know the feeling. Celestia looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She remembered the rumors about Vance Romano's ascension to the head of the family. The quiet war he had waged against his own uncle to protect his younger sister. He wasn't just a brutal pragmatist. He was a survivor of his own family's poison. Does it get easier? Celestia asked. Vance looked back at her. His dark eyes were bottomless, reflecting the dim light of the desk lamp. No, he said honestly. The ghosts just get quieter. Or you get better at ignoring them. He stood up, his joints popping faintly in the quiet room. Get some sleep, Celestia. The Bratva will retaliate tomorrow. Desmond will scramble. The war just started, and I need my architect awake. He turned and walked out the door, leaving her alone in the quiet study. Celestia sat in the leather chair for a long time, the ash-stained money heavy in her hands, listening to the rain beat against the heavy glass windows. The invisibility cloak was gone, burned away by the diesel fires on Pier 47. She was back in the game, playing for the highest stakes against the deadliest man she knew. And for the first time in a year, she didn't feel entirely alone. Sirens wailed in the distance, a constant abrasive soundtrack to the city's unraveling. 3 weeks had passed since the fire on Pier 47, 3 weeks of methodical, surgical strikes against the O'Shea syndicate. Celestia stood by the reinforced glass window of Vance's upstairs study, watching the rain hammer the estate grounds. She was running on nicotine, black coffee, and the sheer toxic momentum of vengeance. Her ribs still ached with every deep breath, a lingering reminder of the kitchen floor, but the sharp agony had dulled into a familiar, manageable throb. The city's underworld was burning, and she was holding the matches. Just as she had predicted, Desmond's paranoia had consumed him. He executed Hayes, the harbour master, within 24 hours of the lost shipment. The harbour patrol subsequently locked down all transit, freezing Desmond's legitimate textile imports. The Bratva, bleeding money and lacking their promised munitions, demanded compensation. To pay them, Desmond ordered a brutal tax hike on his lower ward protection rackets. The resulting street riots were a gift. Vance didn't even have to fire a shot to take the South Ward. He simply sent his men in with cash, offering the desperate local businesses stability, lower rates, and protection from Desmond's enforcers. Desmond's lieutenants, sensing the ship was sinking, began defecting. Celestia turned away from the window as the heavy study door clicked shut. Vance stood in the entryway. He looked rough, a raw, angry cut slashed across his left cheekbone, secured with 2 butterfly bandages. His dark suit jacket was ruined, torn at the shoulder, and smelling sharply of gunpowder and damp concrete. He walked to the liquor cabinet, skipping the glasses entirely, and took a long pull directly from a bottle of rye whiskey. Gabriel hit the offshore routing center, Vance said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His voice was hoarse. Server racks are slag. The accountants surrendered before we even breached the second floor. They handed over the decryption keys to save their own knees. Celestia leaned against the windowsill, crossing her arms. That cuts off his Cayman accounts. He can't move liquid cash anymore. He's completely isolated. He's bleeding out. Vance agreed. He walked over to the leather sofa and dropped onto it, the exhaustion finally pulling him down. He rested his head back, closing his eyes. We intercepted a wiretap on his burner network 10 minutes ago. He's panicking, Celestia. The Bratva sent a hit squad to his primary residence in the hills. He barely made it out. He's operating out of the old meatpacking plant on 9th Street. The cold storage facility, Celestia murmured, her mind instantly recalling the blueprints of her father's empire. It has an underground tunnel network leading to the rail yards. If he's there, he's packing up the master physical ledgers, the blackmail files, the judges, the police captains, the politicians. He's going to use them to barter safe passage out of the country. Vance opened his eyes, tilting his head to look at her. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of his exhausted face. If he gets on a train with those files, he disappears. He rebuilds somewhere else. The war starts all over again in 5 years. Then we don't let him get on a train. Vance sat up slowly, wincing as his bruised shoulder protested the movement. I'm taking a strike team in 20 minutes. We're going to breach the loading docks, secure the files, and leave Desmond for the Bratva squad that's inevitably tracking him. Celestia pushed off the windowsill. I'm coming with you. No. Vance's response was immediate, flat, and uncompromising. You're the architect, Celestia. You stay in the bunker. It's a confined space, heavily fortified, and desperate men don't care who they shoot. He is my father, Vance. She closed the distance between them, stopping just a few feet from the sofa. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the sudden clash of their wills. I spent my entire life being a pawn on his chessboard. I scrubbed your floors to hide from him. I gave you the keys to his kingdom. I am not sitting in a velvet chair while you deliver the final blow. Vance stared up at her. He saw the cold, furious light in her grey eyes. He had spent 3 weeks working beside her, watching her dismantle her own bloodline with a chilling, mathematical precision. They had shared midnight coffees, pored over maps until their vision blurred, and patched each other's wounds. They were not friends. Friendship was a luxury their world didn't afford. But they were mirrors of each other, 2 people forged in the fires of toxic legacies, fighting tooth and nail to break the cycle. He understood her need. It wasn't about violence, it was about closure. Vance sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of his entire, violent life. He reached down to the coffee table, picked up a sleek, black Glock 19, and held it out to her. Grip first. Keep the safety on until you see the whites of their eyes. Vance said quietly. If you fall behind, Gabriel leaves you. Understood? Celestia took the weapon. The cold steel felt familiar, grounding. She racked the slide, checking the chamber with a practiced, fluid motion before clicking the safety on. Understood. Rain slicked the asphalt of the 9th Street Industrial District, turning the roads into black mirrors. Gabriel drove the armored SUV with the headlights killed, navigating by the ambient orange glow of the street lamps. The meatpacking plant loomed ahead, a massive, rusted monolith of corrugated steel and cracked brick. It smelled of ammonia, wet garbage, and old blood. Celestia sat in the back seat, the Glock resting heavy on her thigh. She wore a dark, tactical jacket borrowed from Vance's armory, her copper hair pulled back into a tight, utilitarian braid. Beside her, Vance was entirely still, his breathing slow and measured. He was a professional transitioning into his element. 3 guards at the main gate, Gabriel murmured from the driver's seat, watching through a thermal optic display on the dashboard. 2 on the roof. They look twitchy. Take the roof first, Vance ordered, his voice an icy whisper. Subsonic rounds. We breach through the east loading bay. Celestia, you stay on my 6. Do not deviate. The vehicle rolled to a silent stop in an alleyway adjacent to the plant. 6 of Vance's men, clad in black tactical gear, slipped out of a trailing van, moving like shadows against the brickwork. Celestia followed Vance out into the freezing rain. A pair of muted cracks echoed from the darkness above. The roof sentries slumped out of sight. Vance signaled with 2 fingers. Gabriel slapped a breaching charge against the rusted side door of the loading bay. 3 seconds later, a muffled thump blew the hinges inward, dropping the heavy door onto the concrete with a deafening clang. They moved inside. The interior was freezing, the air thick with condensation. Heavy meat hooks swung lazily on automated tracks above, protesting with metallic shrieks. Gunfire erupted immediately. Celestia pressed her back against a tiled pillar as concrete chipped and flew around her. Vance and Gabriel returned fire with brutal efficiency. The suppressed weapons coughed in the dark, dropping 2 of Desmond's enforcers before they could find cover. Celestia didn't shoot. She kept her weapon low, her eyes scanning the shadows, conserving her focus. She wasn't here for the foot soldiers. Clear, Gabriel shouted over the ringing silence. The main office. Celestia pointed toward a reinforced steel door at the end of the catwalk. It overlooks the sorting floor. That's where the server access is. Vance nodded. They moved up the metal stairs, boots clanking against the grating. Gabriel kicked the steel door open, his rifle raised. The office was in chaos. Paperwork littered the floor. A heavy iron safe in the corner stood wide open, emptied of its contents. Standing behind a massive oak desk, frantically stuffing hard drives into a reinforced canvas duffel bag, was Desmond O'Shea. He froze as Vance and Gabriel stepped into the room, their weapons trained directly on his chest. Desmond looked old. The terrifying titan of Celestia's childhood was gone. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, and a frantic, animal terror danced in his eyes. He slowly raised his hands, dropping a heavy external hard drive onto the desk. Vance Romano, Desmond rasped, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. You've made a point. You took the harbor, you took the wards. Let me walk out of here with this bag, and I sign the rest of the city over to you. Formal surrender. Vance didn't lower his gun. He simply stepped to the side. Celestia walked into the room. She stopped beside Vance, her grey eyes locking onto the man behind the desk. She didn't raise her weapon. She didn't need to. The sheer weight of her presence in the room was enough of a killing blow. Desmond's breath caught in his throat. His hands, still raised in the air, began to tremble violently. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He stared at the sharp line of her jaw, the copper hair, the icy, unforgiving eyes. Celestia, he whispered. The word sounded like glass breaking in his throat. You're dead. The car on the interstate. I bought a corpse, Dad. Celestia said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the hatred that had fueled her for a year. She just felt empty. A girl from the clinic. Cost me 10 grand to swap the dental molds. It was a cheap price to pay to stop you from selling me to the Volkovs. Desmond gripped the edge of the desk, swaying slightly as the reality of his destruction finally made sense. It was you, the textile shipments, the Cayman accounts. You gave him the blueprints. I gave him a roadmap to your throat. Celestia corrected, stepping closer to the desk. You built this empire on fear, Desmond. You thought treating your own blood like collateral would keep you safe. You were wrong. She reached out, grabbed the canvas duffel bag filled with the master ledgers and blackmail files, and slung it over her shoulder. The weight of it was immense, but she didn't flinch. Celestia, please. Desmond pleaded, the arrogance finally shattering, leaving only a desperate, cornered old man. I'm your father. My father died the day he put a price tag on my head. Celestia turned her back on him. She looked at Vance. I have what we came for. The Bratva will be here in 5 minutes. Vance nodded. He looked at Desmond one last time, a look of profound, clinical disgust. He didn't shoot him. A bullet was too merciful. He turned and followed Celestia out the door, Gabriel covering their exit. They left Desmond O'Shea alone in the freezing office, listening to the approaching sirens and the inevitable sound of heavy Russian accents echoing from the ground floor. The ghost had walked free, and the devil was left to pay the bill. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting a pale, bruised light across the tarmac of the private airfield. The rain had stopped, leaving the concrete slick and reflective. A twin-engine Gulfstream sat idling on the runway, the turbines whining a high, steady pitch. Celestia stood near the boarding stairs. She had washed the dirt and gunpowder from her face. She held the canvas duffel bag in her left hand. Vance walked up to her. He pulled a thick, unbranded envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out. A passport. The name is Celestia Davis. Vance said quietly. It'll hold up to Interpol. The routing numbers for a secure Swiss account are tucked in the back. $2 million. The first commission, paid in full. The plane takes you to Costa Rica. You'll be invisible. Celestia took the envelope. She opened it, staring at the pristine blue booklet. Her new face, her new life. It was everything she had fought for. It was the escape hatch she had dreamed of while scrubbing grease off the kitchen floor at 2 a.m. She looked up at Vance. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her. His face was unreadable, the stoic mask back in place. But his dark eyes held a quiet, unspoken weight. He was a man who lived entirely in the dark, and for 3 weeks she had been the only person who understood exactly how to navigate it with him. Costa Rica is boring, Celestia said softly. Vance's brow furrowed, a fraction of an inch. Excuse me? Celestia looked at the passport, then at the idling plane. She had spent her entire life trying to run from the syndicate, trying to hide from the violence. But the truth was, she was exceptional at it. She didn't want to hide anymore. She didn't want to be a ghost. Slowly, deliberately, she tore the passport in half. Vance's eyes widened slightly as she dropped the pieces onto the wet tarmac. Desmond's territory is fractured, Celestia said, stepping closer to Vance, the roar of the jet engines framing her words. The Bratva will try to push in now that he's gone. You don't know their supply lines, Vance. You don't know how to launder through the northern ports. And you do, Vance stated, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking through his exhaustion. I know all of it, Celestia replied, her grey eyes locking onto his. I hear the Romano Syndicate is in need of a new head of logistics, someone who doesn't flinch when the house catches fire. Vance looked at the torn passport on the ground, then back up to the woman who had just burned down an empire and refused to walk away from the ashes. He reached out, his hand wrapping gently around her bruised shoulder. Cancel the flight, Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, warm hum that sent a shiver down her spine. We have work to do. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this dark, gripping journey of betrayal and redemption, please hit that like button right now. It helps the channel immensely. Don't forget to share this video with fellow fans of intense, character-driven mafia dramas. Want more stories where the villains meet their match and the ghosts fight back? Make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought of Celestia's final choice. See you in the next one.